I remember the day the letters came. It was early spring, the kind of morning that looked softer than it really was. The light through our kitchen window had that pale gold tint, and I could still smell the rain from the night before. The world felt fresh that morning, like maybe it had decided to start over. Lily was sitting by the door, legs crossed, tapping her foot against the floor impatiently. She'd been waiting all week for the mail. She always waited for good news out loud, talking about it, imagining it, laughing before it even arrived. I, on the other hand, waited quietly. Hope was something I learned to hold without showing. When the mail truck finally stopped in front of our house, Lily jumped up before the engine even died. I heard the screen door slam, her laughter echoing like music across the front yard. A few seconds later, she came running back in, 2 envelopes clutched in her hand. "Anna, they came," she gasped, breathless. Her excitement filled the whole kitchen. I could feel it buzzing through her, that contagious electricity of someone standing on the edge of something new. She handed me one envelope, thin, white, ordinary, and for a moment, we just looked at each other, smiling. 2 sisters, 2 letters, 2 versions of the same dream. We opened them together. Lily tore hers open first. She always did everything first, and the air in the kitchen changed. "Oh my God," she whispered, then louder. "I got in." Her voice broke into a laugh, and before I could even react, Mom came rushing in from the hallway, her eyes wide, hands wiping on her apron. "What happened?" "I got in, Mom. I got into Hillside University." Mom gasped, that sharp, happy sound that always made me flinch a little, and pulled Lily into her arms. They laughed together, spinning slightly in the small kitchen. "I'm so proud of you, baby," Mom said, her voice trembling in that perfect, cinematic way. I stood there with my letter still unopened, smiling at them, waiting for the moment to be mine too. When they finally turned toward me, Mom said, "Yours came too, honey." I nodded, carefully sliding my finger under the seal. The paper crackled softly. My heart pounded. "Dear Anna," I read silently, line by line. And there it was, the word I'd dreamed of seeing. "Congratulations." I looked up, my chest full of something I hadn't felt in years, a kind of fragile joy, the kind that made me want to cry and laugh at the same time. "I got in too," I said quietly. Lily gasped, her smile wide. "You did? Oh my God, Anna, that's amazing." For a moment, we were both laughing, hugging, 2 sisters standing in the same sunlight, sharing the same dream. Even Mom smiled, that soft, rare smile that used to belong to her younger self. "Both my girls," she whispered. "Both of you made it." It was the happiest I'd seen her in years. And in that brief, shimmering moment, I believed maybe this was the start of something different. Maybe, finally, life was fair. The news spread quickly. Dad came home early that night, his face lighting up as he saw the letters on the table. "My girls," he said proudly. "I always knew you had it in you." He hugged Lily first, lifting her slightly off the floor, laughing. When he turned to me, his hug was shorter, but warm, polite. Still, I told myself it didn't matter. Love didn't have to look the same to still count, right? We ordered takeout that night, something we rarely did. Mom set the table, Dad poured drinks, and the house felt alive in a way it hadn't in years. Lily talked nonstop about the dorms, the campus, the art studios. I listened, smiling, adding in small details about my own program, a small art college downtown, known for its creative scene. Every time I mentioned something, Dad nodded distractedly. Mom smiled, but her eyes always drifted back to Lily. Still, I ignored it, because that night was supposed to be perfect. And I'd learned long ago, you don't ruin perfect, even if it isn't real. Later that night, when everyone had gone to bed, I sat in my room with both acceptance letters side by side. 2 futures, 2 chances, 2 daughters. And for the first time in my life, it felt like we were finally equal. But deep down, some small, buried part of me whispered, "Don't get used to it." Because in our house, equality was temporary. It always found a way to tip. The next morning, I woke to the sound of voices in the kitchen. Mom and Dad were talking softly, the way they did when the topic was serious. I didn't mean to listen, but when you grow up in a house full of silence, you learn to hear even the smallest things. "We can't afford both," Dad was saying. "Not right now. We'll make it work," Mom replied. "Maybe Anna can stay home a year, help out. She's always been mature about these things." There was a pause. Then Dad said quietly, "And Lily, she should go, of course. She's ready. It's her time." My chest tightened. The words felt heavy, like stones dropping into water. I backed away from the doorway before they could see me, my heart pounding too loud for such a quiet house. Back in my room, I stared at my reflection in the mirror, the same tired eyes, the same patient face. I thought of my acceptance letter sitting neatly on the desk. It suddenly looked smaller, less alive. I tried to tell myself it wasn't decided yet, that maybe they'd find a way. But the truth was, I already knew. In this family, dreams weren't shared, they were rationed. And I had learned a long time ago when something had to be sacrificed, it was always me. That evening, Lily came into my room, still buzzing with excitement. I can't believe it, Anna. Can you imagine? We're both going to college. Her voice was full of hope, and I didn't have the heart to tell her that maybe we weren't. Yeah, I said softly. It's amazing. She didn't notice the hesitation. Why would she? Her world had never required her to look for cracks. She sat on my bed, talking about everything she wanted to do. Her dorm decorations, her first day outfit, the people she'd meet. I nodded, smiling where I was supposed to. Every word felt like a thread pulling tighter around my chest. We're finally getting out, she said. We've waited for this forever. The word echoed, but for the first time, it didn't sound like it included me. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay there in the dark, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs, the occasional sound of the clock ticking. It was strange. The night before your dream ends, everything feels normal. No thunder, no signs, no warnings, just quiet. And the quiet is the cruelest part, because it lets you pretend, just for a little longer, that maybe tomorrow will still be kind. Dinner that night smelled like celebration. Mom had cooked too much chicken, potatoes, even a pie, the kind of meal she only made when she was proud of something. The table was set neatly, and the house, for once, felt full. The air had that strange mixture of warmth and tension, like everyone was pretending not to notice the storm forming in the corners. Lily was glowing. Her acceptance letter lay proudly in the center of the table, weighted down by a salt shaker so it wouldn't curl. She'd shown it to every relative, every neighbor, and Mom had started calling her my college girl. Dad sat at the head of the table, smiling as Lily talked about dorm life, her art classes, her new beginning. Mom listened with that soft, proud look that used to live on her face when I was little. The one I hadn't seen in years at least, not directed at me. I tried to focus on my plate. The smell of garlic butter clung to the air. Every sound, the clinking of forks, the soft scrape of a chair felt amplified. So, Dad said finally, we should talk about logistics. Lily stopped mid-sentence. I looked up, sensing something heavy behind his tone. Housing, tuition, expenses we'll need to plan carefully. Of course, Mom said quickly. We'll make it work. There was a pause, and then a silence that lasted too long. I knew that silence. It was the kind that always came before something broke. We've been doing the math, Dad said quietly, and it's going to be tight. Mom nodded, avoiding my eyes. We can't afford both girls at once. The words landed like a slow, deliberate punch. Lily blinked, confused. What do you mean? Dad cleared his throat. You both got into good schools, and that's incredible. But 2 tuitions, 2 sets of expenses, it's just not possible right now. I felt something cold settle inside me. Not surprise, not anger, just that old, familiar feeling, resignation. So what happens? Lily asked. We'll have to make a choice, Mom said. Her voice was too calm, too practiced. And before anyone said it aloud, I already knew what that choice would be. Lily's program has more structure, Mom continued. It's a 4-year degree with a clear path. Anna's is more artistic, uncertain. Dad nodded. You can always apply again next year, Anna. You're responsible. You understand these things. I stared at my plate, watching the steam fade off the potatoes. I wanted to laugh because of course I understood. I had been understanding my whole life. Lily looked between us, her eyes wide. Wait, you're saying I get to go? But she doesn't. Mom reached for her hand. It's not like that, sweetheart. It's just temporary. That's not fair, Lily said, her voice breaking. You both worked hard, Mom said, but her eyes flicked toward me with something like apology or maybe just relief. Anna will be fine, Dad added softly. She's strong. It was meant as a compliment, but it felt like a goodbye. No one looked at me directly. That was the thing about decisions in this family, they weren't made with cruelty, but with avoidance. Like if you didn't look too hard, you could pretend it wasn't hurting anyone. I swallowed. So, Lily goes, I said finally. My voice didn't sound like mine. Mom hesitated. Just until we can figure things out, I nodded. Because what else was there to do? Dad exhaled. Thank you, Anna. We knew you'd understand. And there it was again, that word. Understand. It was the word that had followed me my entire life. When things went wrong, when someone needed to be blamed, when silence had to be kept, I was always the one who understood. I felt something rise in my chest, a small sharp ache that wanted to become anger, but I pushed it down, the way I always did. Instead, I smiled. Of course. Dinner continued after that. Someone made a joke. Mom laughed too loudly. Lily pushed food around her plate, her appetite gone. No one mentioned me again. No one mentioned college again either. It was as if my acceptance letter had vanished the moment they decided. It didn't fit the plan. When we finished eating, I gathered the plates out of habit. Mom tried to stop me. Leave them, honey. I'll take care of it. But I shook my head. It's okay. It always was. As I washed the dishes, I could hear them talking softly in the living room. Mom's voice, full of relief. Dad's low hum of agreement. Lily's silence. Each sound felt like a thread snapping. Later that night, I found Lily sitting on the porch steps. The sky above was bruised with twilight. She looked up as I opened the door. Her eyes were wet. Anna, this isn't right. I sat beside her. The wood was cold beneath us. It's okay, I said quietly. No, it's not, she snapped. Her voice cracked. You wanted this just as much as I did. I smiled, though it hurt. You deserve to go, Lily. So do you. Maybe. But Mom and Dad, they've already decided. She clenched her fists. I'll talk to them again. Don't, I said. It'll just make things worse. She looked at me like she was seeing me for the first time, not as her sister, but as someone living a different kind of life entirely. You always give up so easily, she whispered. I turned to her. No, I said softly. I just learned when fighting doesn't matter. We sat there until the stars came out. Neither of us spoke again, but I could feel the distance growing between us, quietly, like a shadow lengthening with the night. In the days that followed, preparations began. Lily's suitcase appeared in the hallway. Mom started buying supplies, new sheets, notebooks, a lamp. The house buzzed with a strange kind of joy, one that didn't have room for everyone. I stayed out of the way, went to work, cleaned, smiled when expected. At night, I'd pass Lily's room and see Mom sitting on her bed, talking softly, laughing. Once, I stopped by the door and listened. They were discussing what Lily should wear on her first day. Their laughter filled the space between them. Easy, effortless. It was the same laughter that used to fill my room once. Now, it echoed through the walls like a ghost. The night before Lily left, we had another dinner, smaller, quieter. The table felt emptier even though everyone was there. Lily tried to smile, but I could see her guilt sitting heavy on her shoulders. I'll call you every week, she promised. Don't worry about me, I said. Promise me you'll still paint, she said. I didn't answer, because we both knew I wouldn't. When she hugged me goodbye that night, she cried into my shoulder. You're the best sister in the world. I wanted to tell her that being the best sister meant being the one who stayed behind. But instead, I said, I'll miss you, because that was easier than the truth. The next morning, the car engine started early. The air was cold, and the world felt too big. Mom cried again, happy tears, proud tears. Dad loaded the suitcases into the trunk. Lily looked at me from the back seat. Her eyes were full of things she wanted to say but didn't know how. I raised my hand in a small wave. She waved back. The car drove off, and the sound of the tires against the gravel was the last thing I heard before everything went quiet. When I went back inside, the kitchen still smelled like breakfast. Pancakes, syrup, burnt coffee. But the table looked strange, one less plate, one less reason to smile. I sat down, resting my hands on the cool surface, and stared at the empty chair across from me. That's when it hit me. Not the sadness, not even the loss, but the realization that I had never really been part of the plan. I was the space between dreams, the silence that made other people's joy possible. And for the first time, I felt it, the weight of that silence. So heavy, so complete. Lily's suitcase sat open on her bed like a mouth ready to swallow a whole life. The morning light spilled across the floor, touching everything except me. I stood by the doorway, watching her move around the room folding clothes, humming softly, a rhythm of excitement in every step. She had always been like that, alive in a way that drew the world closer. Even when she did nothing, the room seemed to orbit her. "Can you hand me that sweater?" she asked. I picked it up from her chair and passed it to her. It was soft, pale yellow, the one Mom had bought last Christmas. Lily pressed it to her chest, smiling. "It still smells like home," she said. "It will," I replied. She didn't hear the weight in my tone. She laid everything out in careful lines: books, notebooks, hairbrush, the sketchbook I gave her last birthday. The same one she'd filled with drawings of sunlight and smiles. Mine had always been full of shadows. "I can't believe this is really happening," she said. Her voice trembled with joy. "You'll do amazing," I said. "You think so?" "I know so," she smiled, and I could almost believe it too. Mom came in halfway through, carrying folded towels and a list of things Lily might forget. "Don't pack too much," she said. "They have stores there." "I know, Mom," Lily said, laughing. Mom smiled, brushing Lily's hair back like she was still a child. I watched quietly, my hands resting at my sides. That touch, that small, ordinary gesture, it shouldn't have hurt to watch. But it did. Mom turned to me. "Anna, you've always been so good at organizing. Can you help her?" "Sure," I said. She handed me a checklist: toothpaste, charger, pillowcase, the things you take when you're allowed to start over. We worked in silence for a while. Every time Lily zipped something shut, it felt like another piece of our childhood disappearing. Every drawer that emptied left behind a small echo. At one point, Lily sat down, cross-legged on the floor. She looked up at me, eyes soft. "Do you remember when we used to talk about moving out together?" I nodded. "Yeah. We wanted an apartment near the beach. You said you'd paint the sunsets, and you said you'd play music in the kitchen while I did." We both smiled. "The kind of smile that hurts more than it heals. I wish we could still do that," she said. "Maybe one day," but we both knew it wouldn't be soon. That night, I helped her tape a small list to the inside of her suitcase. "Things to remember," she called it. It said, "Call home. Don't forget your sketchbook. Don't be scared." When she wasn't looking, I added one more line at the bottom, small enough that she might miss it. "You're loved even when it doesn't look like it." After Mom went to bed, Lily and I stayed up in her room, sitting on the floor surrounded by piles of clothes and dreams. The air smelled like detergent and cheap perfume. Outside, the streetlight flickered, casting shadows across the boxes labeled "dorm" in black marker. Lily leaned against the bed frame. "Do you think Mom and Dad are disappointed you're not going?" The question was so sudden I almost dropped the shirt I was folding. "No," I said. "You don't sound sure." "They've never been disappointed in something they expected." Lily frowned. "That's not fair." "It's not," I agreed. "But it's true." She looked down, twisting her bracelet around her wrist, the one I'd given her years ago. "I wish I could fix it." "You can't," I said softly. "No one can." When the room grew quiet, I glanced at the sketchbook on her desk. The last page was half drawn, a portrait of our house, warm light spilling from the windows. She caught me looking. "I was going to finish it when I came back." "Don't," I said. She tilted her head. "Why not?" "Because when you come back, it won't look like this anymore." Lily's smile faded. She didn't argue. She just reached for my hand and held it. For a moment, I let myself hold on too. Then I let go, because that's what I'd been trained to do. The next morning, I woke up early. The sun hadn't risen yet, and the house was still asleep. I walked into Lily's room. Her suitcase was closed now, zipper glinting faintly in the dim light. On her nightstand sat two mugs, the ones we'd painted together at the art fair years ago. Hers said "dreamer," mine said "doer." Back then, we thought that meant we were a perfect team. Now, it just felt like a cruel kind of prophecy. I slipped a folded piece of paper into her suitcase pocket, a small sketch I'd drawn the night before. It was of two girls sitting side by side on a porch, looking at the stars. Underneath, I'd written, "Don't forget where your light came from." I didn't sign it. She'd know it was from me. When the house finally woke up, the air felt different, like everyone was pretending it was a normal day. Mom moved around quickly, checking lists, fixing Lily's hair, repeating things she'd already said a dozen times. Dad loaded the car. Lily hovered between excitement and tears. I stood by the door, my fingers gripping the frame, trying to memorize everything: the smell, the sound, the shape of this goodbye. "Ready?" Dad called. "Yeah," Lily said softly. She turned to me, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. "You'll write to me?" she asked. "Every week. Promise?" "Promise." She smiled, and I tried to, but my lips felt heavy. When she hugged me, she whispered into my ear, "I'll make this count for both of us," and then she was gone. The car drove away slowly, and the street fell silent. I stood there until the sound of the engine faded into nothing. The morning light hit the window, and for a moment, I saw my reflection half in light, half in shadow. I touched the glass and whispered, "Good luck, Lily," then after a pause, "Goodbye." That day, the house felt too big. Her room looked like a memory already. The bed neatly made, the shelves to tidy. I sat on the edge of it, holding the mug that said Dreamer. It felt wrong in my hands, like it had forgotten who it belonged to. Somewhere in the distance, I heard a train whistle, the sound of someone else leaving, and I realized, maybe I wasn't meant to have a beginning yet. Maybe my story was the waiting part between other people's chapters. So I stayed, because that's what I was always meant to do. The first morning after Lily left, the house felt heavier. Not empty, just quieter, like it was holding its breath. Mom moved through the kitchen like she was walking through fog, doing things out of habit. Dad left early, his footsteps echoing down the hallway, fading before the door even shut. No one spoke about the car that had driven away yesterday, or about how one of the plates on the table stayed clean. It was as if silence had moved in with us, uninvited, but permanent. I tried to keep myself busy. That's what Mom said. "Keep yourself busy, Anna. Don't just sit around." So I cleaned the windows, the floors, the spaces no one looked at. It felt like if I could make everything spotless, I could scrub away the ache that had settled inside me. But no matter how much I wiped, it stayed. That ache, it had roots. After a week, Mom suggested I find something to do outside the house. It wasn't a request. "You could work," she said over breakfast. "The bookstore downtown is hiring part-timers. It'll be good for you." Good for me. That phrase tasted strange. I wanted to ask, good for what? For being forgotten? For not falling apart? But I just nodded, because saying yes was easier than being seen as ungrateful. That night, I looked through Lily's old sketchbook before bed. Her last drawing, the one of our house, was still unfinished. It made me wonder what mine would look like if I drew it now. Probably smaller, colder, without windows. The bookstore was quiet, the kind of quiet that didn't hurt. Rows of old books, the faint smell of paper and dust. It became my refuge. The owner, Mrs. Reed, was kind. She was in her 60s, with eyes that had seen too much but still softened when she smiled. "You read a lot, don't you?" she asked one afternoon. "Sometimes," I said. "Good. People who read don't get lost as easily." I didn't know what she meant then, but later, I realized books were maps for people who'd forgotten where they were. I worked every day after that, stacking shelves, organizing receipts, listening to the low hum of the radio in the corner. It wasn't exciting, but it was steady, predictable, safe. And maybe that's what I needed, a place where nothing changed, where I didn't have to compete with someone else's brightness. Sometimes when no one was around, I'd sit behind the counter and draw in the margins of old receipts. Tiny sketches, a hand reaching for light, a window cracked open, a girl sitting on a train that never stopped. Mrs. Reed saw one once. She didn't say anything at first. Then quietly, "That's lovely." It was the first time in months someone had said that to me. I didn't know whether to thank her or cry. At home, everything felt mechanical. Mom had found a new rhythm. Her mornings filled with calls to Lily, her evenings with chores and silence. I'd walk past the living room and hear her voice, soft and proud. "Yes, sweetheart, I saw your photos. You look wonderful." "No, don't worry about us. We're fine." Sometimes she'd laugh, the same laugh she hadn't used with me in years, and I'd keep walking, pretending the sound didn't scrape at something inside me. Dinner time changed too. The table that once seated four now felt too big. Mom still set Lily's place, even when she wasn't home. Just in case she visits, she'd say. But we both knew she wouldn't, not soon. Dad talked less now. He'd come home late, eat quickly, and disappear into his study. Sometimes I'd hear the faint click of the television behind the door. The house had its own language, one made of doors closing, clocks ticking, and footsteps that never crossed paths. One evening, I found Mom in Lily's room, folding the blanket on her bed again. She didn't notice me at first. She was humming the same lullaby she used to sing to us when we were little. "You don't have to keep doing that," I said softly. She jumped, startled. "Doing what?" "Keeping her room ready. She's not coming back soon." Mom paused, then smiled, that kind of smile people use to hide tears. "It makes me feel close to her." I wanted to ask, "Didn't I make you feel close once?" But I didn't, because that question wasn't allowed in this house. Instead, I said, "Dinner's ready." She followed me downstairs, and neither of us mentioned it again. At the bookstore, time moved differently. The days blurred into one another, light through dusty windows, pages turning, the soft murmur of customers who barely looked up. Sometimes, I'd watch people leave with books in their hands and wonder what their lives were like, if they had someone waiting for them, if they were loved without condition. There was one man who came every Friday, middle-aged, always in a gray coat, buying the same kind of poetry book. One day, as he paid, he looked at my sketch on the counter. It was a drawing of a window with rain outside. "You drew this?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "It feels lonely." "Maybe it is. Lonely things are honest," he said quietly. When he left, I stared at the empty space he'd stood in and wondered if that was true, if loneliness was just another word for honesty. Months passed. Lily's letters came regularly, colorful envelopes filled with stories about her friends, the campus, the things she was learning. "I wish you could see the art studio here," she wrote once. "You'd love it, Anna. You'd fit right in." I smiled reading that, not because it was true, but because she still believed I could belong somewhere. I pinned her letters above my desk. Each one was a window into a world that wasn't mine. Sometimes I'd reread them late at night, the words blurring together until they felt like whispers. She always signed them the same way: "Love, your little dreamer." I never signed mine back that way. I didn't know what to call myself anymore. Winter came. The bookstore smelled like cinnamon candles and dust. Mrs. Reed gave me a scarf for Christmas, hand-knitted, soft gray, the same color as early morning fog. "You remind me of the quiet ones in novels," she said. "The ones people overlook until they realize they were the whole story." I didn't know what to say, so I just smiled and tucked the scarf around my neck. That night, walking home in the snow, I thought about what she said, and for a moment, just a moment, I wondered if she could be right. Maybe I wasn't invisible. Maybe I was just waiting to be read. At home, the house was dim. Mom had fallen asleep on the couch, the TV flickering quietly in the background. Lily's photo sat on the mantel, her smile frozen mid-laughter. I stood there for a long time, watching the light shift across her face. Then I looked at the empty space beside the frame where another photo should have been. Mine. It wasn't missing. It just had never been there. And I realized the house hadn't just forgotten me. It had never truly remembered. The snow had started melting by the time he appeared. I remember because the gutters outside the bookstore were dripping, each drop falling with a sound like a slow clock. Winter was ending, but it didn't feel like spring yet. The world was somewhere in between, and so was I. The bell above the door chimed softly that afternoon. I looked up from behind the counter and saw a man standing there, tall, middle-aged, with tired eyes and a scarf that looked too heavy for the weather. He nodded at me politely. "Quiet day?" he asked. "Always," I said. He smiled faintly and started wandering through the aisles like he already knew where everything was. He had that look, the kind of person who comes not to buy, but to be somewhere. After a few minutes, he came to the counter with a small pile of books, a poetry collection, a novel with a cracked spine, and a notebook. "You like poetry?" he asked, handing me the books. "Sometimes," I said. "Only sometimes? Only when it doesn't rhyme too neatly." He laughed quietly. "You sound like someone who writes." I hesitated. "I draw." "That's a kind of writing," he said, "just quieter." He came back the next week. And the week after, always on Thursdays, always with a book in hand and something kind in his voice. His name was Samuel. He told me he used to teach literature at a community college before retiring. Now he spent his days reading, walking, and looking for things that still felt honest. He said it like it was a hard thing to find these days. Sometimes he'd stay longer reading in the corner chair near the window while I worked. He didn't talk much, but when he did, his words stayed with me. "Do you ever draw people?" he asked one afternoon. "No," I said. "People move too much, then draw them while they're still." When are people ever still? When they're listening. He looked up at me then, and for a second, I forgot how to breathe. That night, after closing, I sat behind the counter and started to draw. Not him exactly, just the idea of him. Someone standing in a room full of words, but carrying silence like a companion. It was the first time I'd drawn in months. The pencil felt awkward in my hand at first, but then something inside me loosened. By the time I looked up, the store was dark, except for the small lamp beside me. The drawing wasn't perfect, but it was alive. I stared at it for a long time, and for the first time since Lily left, I felt like I was breathing again. Samuel noticed the sketch the next day. "You drew this?" he asked. I nodded. "It's beautiful," he said simply. "It's messy," I replied. "So is honesty." He smiled, not politely, but like someone who meant it. Then he said something that stayed with me. "Don't let the world tell you what's worth keeping." It was such a simple sentence, but it cracked something open in me. All those years of being told what was practical, what was smart, what was allowed, it all came rushing back. I wanted to tell him everything about Lily, about my parents, about the letter I kept hidden in a drawer like a ghost. But I didn't, because when you spend too long being invisible, you forget how to speak your truth out loud. So instead, I said, "Thank you." He just nodded, as if he already knew the rest of the words I couldn't say. Weeks passed. Spring came quietly, the kind of spring that didn't announce itself, just appeared one morning in the smell of wet earth and new leaves. The bookstore grew warmer. Customers came and went, their voices mixing with the sound of pages turning. And every Thursday, Samuel came. We talked about art, about books that broke our hearts, about how loneliness could be both a prison and a companion. "Do you ever regret not doing something?" I asked him once. "Every day," he said. "And what do you do with that?" "I turn it into something that doesn't regret me back." I thought about that all night, about what it would mean to turn my regret into something that could breathe. The next day, I brought a small sketchbook to work, and between customers, I began to draw again. One afternoon, Mrs. Reed noticed. She smiled, but didn't say anything until Samuel left. Then she walked over, her hands still dusted with paper powder. "You're different lately," she said. "Am I? You look like someone who started remembering themselves." I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Maybe both. She touched my shoulder gently. "Keep drawing, Anna. You're not invisible here." At home, I began sketching late at night again. On the kitchen table, in the margins of old bills, on the back of grocery lists. It wasn't rebellion, it was survival. I drew the quiet things, the way the light hit the sink, the steam rising from a forgotten cup of tea, the shape of my mother's hands when she wasn't looking. Sometimes when I'd finish a piece, I'd leave it on my dresser and stare at it, not because it was good, but because it was mine. For so long, everything I did had been for someone else, to make things easier, to keep peace, to fill the spaces silence left behind. But this was just for me, and that made it sacred. One Sunday afternoon, Samuel didn't come, or the next. The chair by the window stayed empty. Dust gathered where his books usually sat. I tried not to think about it. People come and go. That's what life is, a series of arrivals and absences. But every time the bell above the door chimed, my heart lifted then fell again. It wasn't love. It wasn't longing. It was recognition. He had been the first person in years to see me, and now, he was gone too. A week later, Mrs. Reed handed me a small envelope. "Someone left this for you." Inside was a folded piece of paper. It was one of the notebook pages from the store, yellowed, slightly torn. In Samuel's handwriting, it said, "Keep drawing the things no one notices. That's how you'll find yourself again." There was no signature, no return address, just that. I held it to my chest for a long time. Then quietly, I went to my sketchbook and began to draw again. This time, I drew a man standing in a bookstore doorway, half in shadow, half in light, looking at the world like it still mattered. And for the first time, I realized that maybe I mattered too. The first letter arrived 2 weeks after Lily left. It was pale blue, with her handwriting neat, round, the way she used to write notes to me in school. Mom brought it in from the mailbox, smiling. She wrote, she said, waving the envelope like a prize. Dad looked up from his newspaper, his face softening for the first time in days. Let's hear what she says. Mom opened it carefully, like it was made of glass. She read it out loud, her voice trembling with pride. Dear Mom and Dad, the campus is beautiful. My roommate's name is Claire, she's from Boston. Classes are hard, but I love them already. My professors are kind, and everyone is so talented. I finally feel like I'm where I belong. She laughed softly at that part, and I smiled too, or at least, I tried to. But inside, something shifted. Where I belong. Those words stuck in my chest like splinters. After dinner, Mom placed the letter on the fridge, right next to the grocery list. We'll keep all of them here, she said proudly, so we can read them anytime. She didn't notice I was still holding the empty envelope. My name wasn't on it. It had only said Mom and Dad. I told myself it didn't matter, that she probably just forgot. But when the second letter came, and the third, and none of them mentioned me, I stopped pretending. At night, I'd wait for Mom to finish reading the new letters aloud. Then I'd take them down quietly and read them again in the dim kitchen light. Lily's words were full of sunshine, late night study sessions, new friends, cafeteria food that tastes like freedom. She wrote about painting under the skylight in her dorm studio, about how the light there was soft and kind. She even mentioned how one of her professors reminded her of Dad, strict but caring. Every letter ended with, "Love, your little dreamer. Never love, your sister." Maybe she thought it went without saying. Maybe she didn't realize how silence can erase someone, one word at a time. One evening, after reading her latest letter, Mom said, "She's thriving." I knew she would. Dad smiled. "She's got a good head on her shoulders." Then he looked at me. "You should be proud of her, Anna." "I am," I said. And I was. I truly was. But being proud of someone you love while your own life stands still is a quiet kind of heartbreak. It's like clapping for a song you'll never get to sing. At the bookstore, I started bringing Lily's letters with me. During lunch breaks, I'd read them again. Sometimes I'd sketch little scenes from her descriptions, her art studio, her dorm window, the park she wrote about. I didn't know why. Maybe because drawing her world felt like the closest I could get to being part of it. Mrs. Reed saw one of my sketches once, a drawing of a window with sunlight spilling through. "That's beautiful," she said. "It's someone else's sunlight," I replied. She looked at me for a long time before answering. "Sometimes borrowed light still warms you." I wanted to believe her, but I didn't feel warm. The letters kept coming. By spring, the fridge was covered with them, a collage of someone else's happiness. Mom started reading them over breakfast, laughing softly at Lily's stories. She joined a painting club. Can you imagine? She's even helping organize an art exhibition on campus. I looked up then, startled. She is? Yes. Isn't that wonderful? I smiled weakly. It was wonderful, but the ache that followed was worse than envy. It was grief, the grief of watching someone else live the life that once had your name on it. One afternoon, while cleaning, I found an old photo under Lily's bed. It was from years ago, both of us sitting in the backyard, painting side by side. Our canvases were crooked, our smiles wide. In the background, Mom was watching from the kitchen window. It was such a simple moment, but it made my throat tighten. I slipped the photo into my sketchbook, not to keep her close, but to remind myself she was real, that we once belonged to the same world. Then, one day, a letter came with my name on it, just mine. Mom handed it to me, surprised. "Oh, this one's for you." The envelope was small, the handwriting rushed. My heart pounded as I opened it. "Anna, I miss you. I think about you every day. I know it's unfair. You should be here too." I told Mom and Dad again that they made a mistake. They just say you're doing fine. "Are you? Please tell me you're okay. Love, Lily." I read it over and over. Those words, "you should be here too," they were both a comfort and a wound. I didn't reply right away. What could I say? That I was fine? That I was proud of her? That every night I drew the things she described, as if sketching could make them mine. So I didn't write back, not that day. A week later, another letter came, shorter this time. Anna, did you get my last letter? I hope I didn't say anything wrong. I love you, Lily. This one smelled faintly of paint and lavender. I held it to my face and breathed in. For a moment, it felt like she was there beside me again. I sat down and finally wrote back, Lily, I'm okay. I miss you too. I'm still drawing, not much, but some. Mom and Dad are proud of you. You deserve everything good that's happening. Love, Anna. It was the truth, or at least the version of truth that wouldn't make her feel guilty. I mailed it the next morning, and for the rest of the day, my chest felt lighter and heavier all at once. After that, our letters became a quiet rhythm. Not constant, but steady. She told me about her first art show, about late-night pizza runs, about a professor who said her work had soul. I told her about the bookstore, about Mrs. Reed, about the man named Samuel who'd told me to keep drawing. You'd like him, I wrote. He believes in the kind of art that saves people. She replied a week later, then he sounds like you. I smiled at that, because maybe, in some small way, she still saw me. But the distance between our lives kept growing. Hers was full of light and noise. Mine was made of quiet and dust. Sometimes when I'd close the bookstore, I'd imagine her standing in front of a painting, laughing, surrounded by people who understood her. And I'd wonder if she ever missed the girl who used to hand her sweaters, pack her bags, and stay behind. The last letter she sent that year came in late summer. It was long, full of excitement. Anna, I won an award at the student exhibition. Mom and Dad are coming to see me next month. I can't wait to show them my studio. I wish you could come too. She'd drawn a small doodle of a flower at the bottom, simple, imperfect. Exactly like the ones we used to draw as kids. I traced it with my finger and whispered, I wish I could too. Then I pinned it above my desk, next to all the others. The wall was covered now, a mosaic of her handwriting, her dreams, her world. And as I stood there looking at it, I realized something. This house wasn't empty. It was just full of someone else's life. That night, I took out a clean sheet of paper and began to draw. Not her world this time, but mine. The bookstore, the quiet street outside, the chair by the window where Samuel used to sit, the reflection of my own face in the glass. It wasn't colorful, it wasn't perfect, but it was honest. And for the first time, that felt like enough. Summer arrived slowly that year. The air was thick with heat and something heavier, the kind of weight that doesn't come from weather. At the bookstore, we'd started leaving the door open during the day. The smell of dust and old paper mixed with the scent of rain-soaked pavement. It was the kind of smell that made you nostalgic for things you hadn't even lived. One afternoon, Mrs. Reed called me into the back room. She was sitting at her desk, glasses low on her nose, a letter spread out in front of her. Anna, she said, you might want to see this. I frowned. She slid the paper toward me, a flyer printed on heavy cream paper. It read, State Arts Fellowship Annual Application open now. For artists without formal education. Funding available for independent creative study. At the bottom, in bold, for those who never got their chance. My heart skipped a beat. They've been giving these grants for years, Mrs. Reed said. But this one sounds like it was written for you. I picked up the flyer, my hands trembling. A scholarship, not for grades, not for degrees, but for people like me. People who still dared to dream, even after the world told them not to. You should apply, she said firmly. You have talent, Anna, real talent. I stared at her. You've only seen my doodles. I've seen your soul in them, she said simply. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at my desk staring at my sketchbook. The lamp buzzed faintly, and outside, the street was empty except for the sound of wind through the trees. I turned the flyer over in my hands. It felt like holding a heartbeat. For the first time in years, I let myself imagine it, packing my bags, walking into an art studio filled with light, signing my name on a new beginning. I thought of Lily, how she used to talk about finding her place. And for the first time, I wondered if maybe there was still a place left for me too. The next morning, I told Mom. We were in the kitchen. She was making coffee, the same brand she'd bought for years. Mom, I said softly, there's a scholarship I want to apply for. It's for people who, oh honey, she interrupted. That sounds nice, but you're already working so hard. You don't need more on your plate. It's not work, I said quickly. It's for art. They give funding to study art, she said, turning to face me fully now. Anna, be serious. You know how hard things are right now, but it's a full scholarship, I insisted. I wouldn't have to pay anything. Nothing is ever truly free, she said sharply. Her voice was calm, but her eyes were tired, the same tiredness I'd seen all my life whenever I asked for too much. I just want to try, I said quietly. You don't have to understand. I just need you not to stop me, she sighed. Talk to your father first. That evening, I did. He was sitting in his chair, the TV flickering blue light across his face. Dad, there's a scholarship program I want to apply for, I began. It's for independent artists. He muted the TV. A scholarship? Yes. It could let me study again. Maybe even leave town. He stared at me for a moment, then shook his head slowly. We can't afford distractions right now, Anna. It's not about money, it's always about money, he said, and about priorities. Your sister's in her 3rd year now. We need to make sure she finishes strong. There it was again, your sister. Those 2 words that seemed to shrink my whole existence. So I have to wait for her life to end before mine begins? I asked before I could stop myself. He looked at me, surprised, maybe even hurt. Don't be dramatic, he said finally. You're helping this family in ways your sister never could. You're the steady one. Steady. That word didn't sound like praise anymore. It sounded like a cage. For days, I tried not to think about it. I worked, I drew. I pretended not to feel the ache pressing against my ribs. But at night, the flyer sat on my desk, its edges curling slightly like it was waiting for an answer. Lily called that weekend. Mom put her on speakerphone during dinner. Her voice filled the room, bright and alive. Guess what? She said. I got an internship at a gallery in New York. Mom gasped. That's incredible, sweetheart. It's just for the summer. But still, the professor recommended me. Dad smiled proudly. You've always been the ambitious one. And then he said it, that one line that would echo in my head for weeks. We'll do whatever it takes to support you, Lily. I froze, my fork halfway to my mouth. They hadn't said that to me. Not once. They never had to. Because they never believed I needed it. Later that night, after everyone went to bed, I sat in the kitchen under the dim yellow light. I took the scholarship flyer out of my bag and placed it on the table. Beside it, I laid out my sketches, dozens of them, drawn on scraps of paper. Receipts, napkins, whatever I could find. They looked fragile, like something that could be blown away with one breath. But together, they looked like a life, my life. And I realized if I didn't at least try, I'd be trapped here forever. The next morning, I filled out the application. My hands were shaking as I wrote my name, as I listed my experience, which wasn't much, but it was honest. Mrs. Reed helped me type the essay. Why do you create art? The prompt asked. I wrote, because it's the only way I know how to stay alive without making noise. When I was done, Mrs. Reed hugged me. You did it, she said. No matter what happens now, you did something for yourself. For the first time in a long while, I felt proud. Not because of approval, but because I'd chosen me. A few weeks passed. I didn't tell my parents I had submitted it. I wanted to wait just until I knew. Then, one afternoon, I got a letter in the mail. It was small, simple, and when I opened it, my hands were shaking. Dear Anna, congratulations. You have been selected as one of the finalists for the State Arts Fellowship. Please prepare your portfolio for review within the next 2 weeks. My heart stopped. I read it twice, 3 times. Then I laughed quietly, disbelievingly. It wasn't everything, but it was something. A door had opened, one I never thought I'd see again. That night, I told my parents. I wanted to be honest. I wanted them to see that I was still worth believing in. Mom listened, her hands still wet from washing dishes. Dad stood by the sink, silent. A scholarship? He repeated slowly. Yes, I said, smiling nervously. They want to see my portfolio. It's an incredible opportunity. He sighed. Anna, this isn't the right time. What do you mean? Your mother's been worried about the bills. Your sister's moving to New York for the summer. We need to help her settle. Dad, this is my chance, and what happens if you don't get it? Then I'll try again. And in the meantime, I'll still have tried. He looked at me not angry, but tired. You're not a child anymore, Anna. You can't keep chasing dreams. That line hit harder than any shout could. Mom added softly, you're the responsible one. You understand what needs to be done. And there it was again, that word, understand. I felt something inside me crack. You always say that, I whispered. You always tell me I understand. But did you ever stop to ask what it costs me? They stared at me shocked, like they'd never heard my voice before. All I've ever done is make things easier for you, I said, trembling. I stayed when you told me to. I smiled when it hurt. I gave up things you didn't even know I wanted. And now, when I finally ask for one thing, one small thing, you call it selfish? Mom's eyes filled with tears. Dad's jaw tightened. No one spoke. The silence felt like a door closing. I turned and walked out. That night, I sat at the park behind the bookstore. The city lights flickered in the distance. I could hear laughter from a bar down the street, the kind of sound that belonged to lives that didn't know mine existed. I pulled out my sketchbook and drew until the page tore. When I was done, I realized I'd drawn a girl standing at the edge of a cliff, not falling, not jumping, just standing, waiting, and in her hands, she held a paper that read, finalist. A week later, I sent my portfolio anyway. I didn't tell anyone, not my parents, not even Mrs. Reed. And maybe that was the first real act of rebellion I ever committed. Because sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is not run away but simply refuse to disappear. Years passed quietly. The seasons folded into each other like pages turning in a book. I was no longer reading. The bookstore closed after Mrs. Reed retired. The building was sold, and for a while, I didn't know where to go. I moved into a small apartment above a coffee shop, the kind of place that smelled like burnt espresso and second chances. I kept drawing. At first, it was to fill the silence. Then it became something more, a way of remembering that I was still here. I never won the fellowship. I didn't even get a response. But I kept the letter, the one that called me a finalist, folded neatly inside my sketchbook. Because sometimes, the proof that you tried is enough to keep you alive. Years blurred. Mom's hair turned silver. Dad's voice softened. They never mentioned the scholarship again, and I never brought it up. Lily finished school, moved to New York full-time, and started working at a gallery. Her art became known. Her name appeared in small magazines, and sometimes I'd see photos of her smiling, surrounded by people who looked like they belonged. She wrote less often. Life has a way of pulling people forward, away from where they started. But I kept her letters, every one of them tucked inside a box beneath my bed, because even if she forgot to write, I never forgot to wait. One autumn afternoon, I was sketching in the park when my phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number, but something inside me knew. Anna? Her voice was softer than I remembered, older, tired. Lily? Yeah. There was a pause. Then quietly, I'm home. I froze. Home? For a few days. I was hoping to see you. My chest tightened. It had been nearly 8 years. 8 years since the morning she left with her suitcase and a smile. Okay, I said. Okay. She came by the next day. I almost didn't recognize her at first. Shorter hair, sharper clothes, the kind of confidence that comes from being seen by the world. But when she smiled, I saw the girl who used to sit on the porch with me, dreaming about apartments by the sea. You look good, she said. So do you. We stood there awkwardly for a moment, then laughed a small, careful laugh as if we were afraid it might break. We went to the old cafe near the square, the same one we used to walk past after school. She told me about her work, the gallery, the exhibitions, the people she'd met. I listened, smiling, and felt something strange. Not envy, not pride, just distance. You should have been there, Anna, she said suddenly. You were always the artist, not me. I shook my head. You earned it. No, she said softly. I just had more permission. The words hung between us. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out something wrapped in paper. I brought you this. Inside was a framed sketch, one of my old drawings, the one of two girls sitting on a porch, looking at the stars. I stared at it, my throat tightening. Where did you get this? It was in my suitcase, she said. You slipped it in before I left. I found it again last year. I kept it on my desk. She looked up at me, her eyes shining. You've always been with me, even when I didn't deserve it. I wanted to say something, to tell her it was okay, that I forgave her, that I forgave everyone, but the words caught in my throat. We sat in silence for a while, watching the world move outside the window. Finally, she said, "Mom's been asking about you. She could call," I said quietly. "She doesn't know what to say." I nodded. "Neither do I." Lily reached across the table, her hand warm against mine. "You were always stronger than me, Anna." "No," I said softly. "I just got used to holding things longer." She laughed through her tears. And for the first time in years, we looked at each other, really looked, and saw not who we were supposed to be, but who we'd become. The house looked smaller now. The paint on the porch had faded, the garden overgrown. Mom was in the kitchen, her hands shaking as she stirred the soup. When she saw us, she froze. "Anna," she whispered. I smiled. "Hi, Mom." For a long moment, no one moved. Then she walked toward me slowly, like she was afraid I might disappear if she blinked. She wrapped her arms around me, and I let her. It didn't fix anything. It didn't erase the years, but it was something. Sometimes that's all forgiveness is, a small, quiet something. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, I stood outside on the porch. The air was cool, the kind of cold that makes you feel alive. The stars were faint city light bleeding through the sky, but I could still see a few of them. Lily came out, her arms wrapped around a blanket. "Do you still draw the stars?" she asked. "Sometimes." "Why?" "Because they're far away, and they don't need me to understand them." She smiled softly. "Do you ever wish things were different?" I thought for a moment, then said, "Sometimes. But if they were, I wouldn't know who I am now." She looked at me then, really looked, and in her eyes, I saw all the years between us collapse into nothing. We stood there together, not as sisters divided by favoritism or regret, but as two women who had finally learned to live with what life had given them. The silence between us wasn't heavy anymore. It was full of everything we'd never said, and everything we didn't need to. A few months later, I opened my first small exhibition in a corner cafe downtown. The walls were lined with sketches of windows, porches, and quiet rooms. The last piece on the wall was titled, "The Dream That Wasn't Mine." It was a drawing of two girls, one holding a suitcase, the other holding a pencil, both looking at the same horizon, but from different sides of the road. When people asked what it meant, I just smiled and said, "It's about learning to live with the dreams you didn't get." Lily came to the opening. Mom and Dad too. They stood in front of that drawing for a long time, holding hands. No one spoke. They didn't have to, because in that moment, everything that had been broken was still broken but no longer bleeding. That night, after everyone left, I turned off the lights, sat alone in the empty gallery, and looked at my own work. For so long, I had believed my story didn't matter, that it was just a shadow beside someone else's light. But sitting there, surrounded by the quiet I had built with my own hands, I realized something. It had never been Lily's dream or mine. It had been both of ours, shared, reshaped, and reborn in different forms. She chased hers through the world. I found mine in the stillness. And maybe that was enough. The next morning, I watched the sunrise from my window. The sky turned gold, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like the forgotten one. I just felt here, alive. It was never my dream, I whispered to the morning light, but I made it mine, and the world, in its quiet way, felt like it finally understood.